Well, friends, we are here as a church. We are continuing this series we started last week called Overflowing. Zach, if you would run my slides for me, because I left my clicker over there, so if you could run my slides for me. Overflowing is a series we have been in. We started last week. Brian did a fantastic job last week kicking us off and getting us off the ground with this series that is talking about what it means to be filled with the overflowing generosity and grace and love that God pours into our hearts, and how we can in turn pour that out to those around us. One of the things that is so helpful that I think Brian mentioned last week is what it means for us to live with open hands, to not hold on to our stuff so tightly that we lose sight of why we were given those things, why we have those things. And this morning, we're going to talk about open tables. What does it mean to have open tables? I remember, anyone remember your middle school years? Some of y'all, that was more recent than others, right? Remember going to the middle school lunchroom, especially like the first week of your first year in middle school, and your time to go to lunch, it's the first time you haven't been seated by class, and you go through the lunch line, and you get in, and you come out of the lunch line with your tray of food, of good old school square pizza, some chocolate milk, right? And you're looking around going, where am I going to sit? Where am I going to sit? I don't have assigned seats. So you walk down the aisles, and oh, I don't know them, I don't know them, I don't know them. Ooh, that guy's in first period. I'm going to go sit with him. And you get there, and he kind of gives you that look like, I don't really want you to sit here right now. And then you finally find some other friends, right? And you find a place, and you sit down. And when you sit down, that joy of being, I now have a place. I now have a place that's mine, a place where I am welcomed, a place where I can sit and enjoy a meal and conversation, and I know that I am welcomed. And it's such a special thing because it's so good to have a place at the table, right? I remember growing up as a kid at our family dinners. We had the family dinner table where all the family sat, unless you were a child. And then you sat in the other room, right? The kids' table. And I always wanted to sit at the big table until one year I got the opportunity to sit at the big table, and I realized how boring it was. And then I went back. Right? You always want a place that is yours, a place that is welcoming. It's a symbol of belonging, of connection, of generosity, of love, both for you, for the people who are there, and the fact that they welcomed you into that table. I imagine that many of your greatest memories are probably around table, with friends or with family, sharing meals, sharing conversation, and it's never about the food, it's about the time you spent with those people. And in the Gospel of Luke, we see an encounter that's similar to this. Jesus is having dinner in Luke 14, which is where we're going to be today. If you want to get your Bibles, Luke 14 is where we're going to be. Right? And he's having this encounter, this party at a Pharisee's house. And you can take it down, Zach, for right now. We don't need it right now. But he's having this encounter with these Pharisees. He's come to this party. And it's a Sabbath. It's a day of rest. There's no work being done. So they've come to relax and have this dinner gathering together. And they're at this party, but Jesus is incredibly frustrated because there's a gentleman at the party who has swelling in his legs and his arms. We don't really know what's wrong with him, but he's been suffering. And Jesus sees the partying going on, but this guy suffering in the midst of it. And so Jesus does what Jesus does. He's going to heal the guy. And of course the crowd, because a lot of them are Pharisees and religious elite, they get all, don't do that. I know he's in pain, but it can wait till tomorrow morning, Jesus. This is the Sabbath. We can't break those rules. Those rules are sacred. You can't help somebody even on the Sabbath. And Jesus gets a little perturbed, as you would imagine, right? These people lack a generous spirit. They're more concerned with protocol than they are with people. And Jesus is frustrated by this. But the story goes on. Jesus continues to be more frustrated. The second thing that Jesus gets frustrated about is he looks around, and the party hasn't even started, and there are already people seated in the two places of honor at the table. Now, what you need to understand about this is that in the first century in Judea, in Jerusalem, even in the Roman world, right, there's this way of eating. There's a social order to dinner and to banquets, interactions. The table was an important place then as it is now. There were all kinds of protocols and guidelines about when you went to a party, who sat where and why they sat there. Right? There was a social order around this. And oftentimes, just like today, there were deals that got made over tables. There were plans that got made around tables. Conversations were important. And they had this big dinner party, and certain people were invited because they had status or because they needed to be invited. And all these people are coming, and yet already the two places of honor are taken. Now, if you're not familiar, in the ancient Near East, there was this thing that the Romans called a triclinium. It's how they ate. There would be a small table about yay high, right? Like think of a coffee table with food spread out on it. And there would be 3 couches surrounding this table. And they wouldn't sit, they would recline with one arm reclined, and they would eat with their other hand. Kind of like dipping in like a charcuterie board or something, right? That's how they ate. We thought about doing this for the Last Supper demonstration, but we didn't want some of our more experienced individuals to have to sit on the floor during the Last Supper demonstration. Took a second. But they're just enjoying, they're relaxing, and when you get there, the host would sit in a very specific place. At the head of the table, at the front of the table. People on each couch around them, but to the right and to the left, immediately next to the host. Those were the places of honor. The most honored guest would sit in one of those 2 places. These were known as the places of honor, and if you remember the story of James and John in Mark 10, when Jesus gets mad because they come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, we want to know, can we sit at your right hand and at your left hand in the coming kingdom? Can we sit at the places of honor? And Jesus gets mad. He says, that's not for me to grant. That's for God the Father to grant. Those places of honor were sacred in that day and time. Now, as a parent, we have the same kind of struggle, right? Whenever we go to dinner with grandparents or with family, there's a battle for who's going to sit next to grandma or grandpa. Never next to mom or dad, just who's sitting next to grandma or grandpa, because there might be treats involved or other activities involved, right? Things being passed under the table. That's what happened in this story. People want to sit in these places of honor. They want to sit in these special seats. And Jesus is making his point. He's talking to 2 different people in this story we're going to read. He's talking to the individuals who are desperate to sit in the places of honor. He's also going to talk to the host. Right? These people have come to this party because they want to be seen. They want to see and be seen by the people in high society around them. And he's addressing the host, who sometimes and often would invite people to a dinner not based on that they wanted them there, but based on the fact that they needed to invite them. That was their ticket to the next social invitation that they were going to get. Right? Here's how Jesus approaches this teaching. He's teaching, it looks like table etiquette, right? But it's not really table etiquette. It's about a new way of interacting in the world in the coming kingdom. So we're Luke 14, verse 8, Zach. Here's what it says. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So Jesus, he's not really teaching table etiquette, right? He's teaching something about the coming kingdom of God. Jesus is saying that generosity flows from a humble heart. When you see the place of honor as yours, you don't have a humble heart. You can't be generous. One of the most powerful things about this movement called Christianity is that for the first several hundred centuries of the movement of the church, the Christian people were known as the people all around wherever they were. They were the one group you could count on, that when the chips were down, they would forego their own self-interest and make sure that people were served. They'd build hospitals, they'd build education centers, they would stay in the midst of a plague and risk their own lives to make sure the sick were taken care of. They put the other's needs ahead of their own. Because generosity flows from that humble heart that Jesus talks about. And here's the thing, you don't have to be rich to be generous. In fact, it's harder to be generous if you're rich. Right? It's not a prerequisite for generosity. You don't have to have something more than somebody else to be generous. A generous spirit can be done with whatever God has given us. There are people all over the socioeconomic spectrum and all over the world who are generous with everything God has given them because they are so acutely aware of the grace and love that God has poured into their life. And they want nothing more than to share that with others. One of the things I love about Buckhall Church is that our church is so full of people who have that humble heart, who have that generous spirit. One of the things that people have told me from day one, before I even got here, about this church, and it's proved to be so true over the last 3+ years, right, is that if there's a need that is brought to this congregation, it will be met. And it will be met and then some. People will meet the needs of the community that are brought to them and they need to fulfill, if not exceed them, because people at this church are so aware of the grace of God, many of you, that you can't help but overflow that generosity. And at this dinner party, Jesus is beginning to address the host. He's talked to the guests, now he's going to talk to the host. Luke 14, chapter 12, he says this to the host. He says, I'm going to tell you something. He said, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. He's saying, listen, think about who you're inviting to the table. Think about who you're inviting to the party. Who have you given the seats of honor? When you planned out this party, who were the most important guests you were going to bring? So see, the way of the world then and the way of the world now is to make sure that we invite someone who would bring us status by their presence, who might then also invite us to a greater party. I remember being in high school and in college, right? If you threw a party, you wanted to make sure the most popular people were there. If they had a good time, you were guaranteed an invitation to next Friday's party. And increase the status of your party, right? But the kingdom way, according to Jesus, is that the guests who are around the table should be the guests who cannot offer any kind of benefit to the host, who can't give them anything. It's not so much about who's invited, Jesus says, but why they're invited. Why did you invite that person? What's the motivation behind it? Why are we having this meal? Are we looking for a benefit for ourselves to feel good about? Or are we trying to truly be generous to others? See, the true test of generosity is not whether or not we are willing to give to those in need, but whether we are willing to give with a zero expectation of repayment. With zero expectation. Somebody might even say it was a wasted investment. Are we willing to give when there's something on the line? Not looking for repayment or recognition, but looking for an opportunity to simply be generous. What the Big C church, the global church, friends, what the church needs more than anything else right now is a group and groups of committed followers who will back their Sunday church attendance, who will back their church talk, who will back their social media posts and shares, who will back it with financial sacrifice and calloused hands of service. We can say we go to church. We can tell the world that we love Jesus, but if our lives don't bear it, why are we doing it? Being fully aware that the individuals that we serve, the individuals that we partner with, have nothing to offer back to us. Serving from our time, our attention, our energy, and our resources, knowing there's nothing to be gained from it. There's nothing to be repaid with. That's the generous life. That's what Jesus is trying to teach the host in this story. Because a generous spirit comes from a humble heart that recognizes that God has poured everything into them and everything they have is God's. So Jesus says this to the host. He says, don't invite the people you normally invite. Don't invite the people that might be influential, people who could pay you back. And instead he says this in verse 13, 14:13. Here's what it says. Verse 13. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, the outcasts. Then, at the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. Jesus says it's time to reevaluate who's coming to the table. Why are they there? The poor, the crippled, the lame, the very people you have cast out of society, they should be the ones at the table. What you need to understand is in the ancient Near East, when these parties would happen, they didn't have air conditioning and closed-in rooms and closed-in houses. They would have outdoor lavish spaces. Houses would be open to the street. Party would be inside, but those on the street could see the party, could see the fun, could see what was happening. So imagine this meal that Jesus is at, with all the religious elite of Jerusalem, gathered around fine tables with fine food, on fine couches, and 20 feet away, watching from the street, are the people that those people have cast out. And they want a part of that meal. They desperately want to be a part, but instead they're being ignored. And Jesus says they are the ones who should be in here. They should be at the places of honor. They should be enjoying this meal. You see, Jesus' table manners make outsiders feel like insiders. All throughout the scriptures we see this when the way Jesus interacts around food. Right? He always has food involved. Jesus was a good Methodist. There was always food. Right? He feeds 15 to 25,000 people on a field next to the Sea of Galilee. He ate with sinners. He ate with tax collectors. He goes to Zacchaeus' house for dinner. He cooks fish on the beach with his disciples after the resurrection. It was culturally one of the best ways to build a relationship, to symbolize connection and validate other people. Now, you can go back to the home screen on that, Zach. How many of y'all during the pandemic, back in 2020, watched more television than you used to watch? We got very rich. We got very familiar with Netflix and other things, right? There was a show that I remember stumbling upon back then. It's called Somebody Feed Phil. Did anybody watch that show? I got one or two hands, right? I watched a couple episodes of it back then. It was a great, cute little show. I didn't realize this until I looked the other day. There's now 6 seasons of this show. I need to catch up, right? But the show called Somebody Feed Phil, it's done by this guy named Phil Rosenthal. He's the writer who created Everybody Loves Raymond, if you saw that show back in the day, right? It's the most simple plot of any television show ever. Phil goes around, and he goes to different parts of the world, and he explores different cultures and different foods, and he just sits down with people and he eats. One bite at a time, they have this conversation, and there's really nothing to this show other than the conversation and the exploration. And this is what Netflix says, the description on Netflix says this: Phil has a childlike wonder and curiosity about different cultures, with food serving as the entry point of deeper understanding and significant connection. After eating with Phil, strangers feel like family. Whether it's from sharing a love of pork or sharing a good laugh, Phil grows his family in every new city. Now, what was shocking to me is when I watched this show, I had 2 thoughts. My first thought was, we have a new show that is more about nothing than Seinfeld was. Show literally about nothing, right? My second thought is, man, I really want to be around that table. They're just having a good time. I want to be a part of what's going on. And all they're doing is sitting and eating and communing together. That's all they're doing. But it's such a welcoming, loving place to be. And I think why Jesus has this conversation with his people, this party, is that he believes that his followers of God, his disciples, should be throwing the kinds of parties that people look at and go, I want to be a part of that. That we throw in parties, people say, I can't wait to be at that table. Not because I want to be seen, not because I want to see, but because I want to recognize the overflowing spirit of generosity that God has poured into me, and I want to spend time and connection pouring it back out. It feels like love. It feels like the right thing. See, Jesus understood that generosity is not just about sacrificial giving, but it's also about sacrificial living. It's as much about writing checks as it is about creating parties, about having meals, about making space for others to feel like they matter, they are belong, they are loved and seen by God. So you can't pay your way out of doing these things. Jesus is saying you can put on the garments, you can be the religious elite, but if you're not living the life of generosity, you're not living it at all. Making me wonder, what if the next time you invite somebody to church, you invite them to dinner on Saturday night first? You spend time with them, getting to know them, that connection, that talk. And what's shocking about Jesus' message here is that he doesn't just say, fill your table with people who can't repay you, but fill your table with all these kinds of people that you would never go have a meal with. And if you do, Jesus says, there will be a repayment, not the one you expect. There will be a repayment in the end. Your sacrifice will have echoes not just here, but echoes in eternity, in the kingdom of heaven. But beyond that, there's another reward too. When we have a generous spirit, there's one more reward. You know what it is? We become a generous person. Now you might say that's a terrible reward, but it's actually a great reward. The reward of being a generous person is your character becomes shaped like Jesus. You become to look like Jesus. It becomes second nature to give people, to give grace to people that you don't even know. You don't even have to think about doing it. You just naturally overflow with that generosity and that grace. And we end up looking more and more like Jesus Christ. The reward of being a generous person is you get to be a generous person. If Jesus is trying to teach this, I think there's three things in particular he's trying to teach, particularly to the host, and things I think you and I need to learn today. And the first is this: a good host invites everyone to come. There is no exclusive guest list. There's no special credential. There's no pass. There's no password, right? In fact, hosts sometimes will invite people to come even if they know those people won't show up. How many of y'all did this with weddings, either your own or families, right? You invite people you know aren't going to show up, but you're going to invite them because you'd love to see them if they did show up. Right? I remember we sent 20 invitations to my family in South Carolina. I knew they weren't going to come, but I would have loved to have seen them if they had come. Right? Some people you invite, you know they're only going to show up if you mention in the invitation that there is food available. Right? They're only coming for the food. But you know what? You invite them anyway, because you never know what might happen. We come to recognize and realize the tables of God that we are invited to are because of God's grace and God's generosity towards us, regardless of our own background, regardless of our own situation, regardless of where we've lived in life. Simply because we are so loved by God that he wants us at his table. The most natural thing is then to turn around and offer that same generosity to anyone else we encounter. We become great hosts because we have been hosted well by Jesus himself. And we in turn make more space at the table for more people to come and see. Second thing is this: a good host sets the table at their own cost. Did you ever throw birthday parties for your kids when they were little? Those themed parties for families and friends that the kid has no idea what's going on, right? But yet you throw out a Paw Patrol blast party with 18 million decorations, colored themed cupcakes, themed decorations. I remember we did one of these, I think it was one of Leighton's parties. And I remember thinking in my mind, like, how much does all this decorating cost? This is ridiculous. She's like 2. What does it matter? But then I also had a relationship that said, you know what? It doesn't matter. Spend the money. Let's have a party. Let's enjoy. Parties are expensive. No matter what you're doing, parties are expensive. This morning, we got to recognize that if you're going to live a generous life, it's going to cost you something. It's going to require you to say no to something so you can say yes to something greater. See, setting the table for others means providing tables and meals and food for people who otherwise would not have it. Setting the table means providing Christmas gifts for children whose parents can't afford to give them good Christmas gifts through our Untrimetry program. Side note, you'll get that list will be out in about 3 weeks. Start thinking about that. Right? Setting the table means buying groceries for that single mom behind you in line at the food line or Harris Teeter. It will cost you something, but that's the price of generosity. The reward, though, is what? Becoming a generous person. The third one is this: a good host expects nothing in return. My grandmother was one of the best cooks I've ever had in my life. And I know everybody says that about their grandmother, right? But everybody in town loved my grandmother's cooking. And I always remember my grandmother saying when somebody would come up to her to compliment the dish, she'd say something to the effect of, "Well, hon, I'm just glad you can eat it. I just hope you enjoy it." She really didn't want the praise. She didn't want it. She didn't care, right? And I remember we had big family meals. She would sit at the head of the table as the host, and we would all be feasting at Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, whatever, right? And she would always have this tiny little plate of stuff. Now, she was a little woman. She didn't eat a whole lot, right? But it dawned on me later why she always had such a small plate. She didn't care about the food. She didn't care about the meal. And she also very rarely said anything at the table. She liked to watch her family around that table eat. To watch those who gathered listen to what was going on. To soak it in. to soak in that experience, to see the joy on their families' faces. All she needed was your presence at the table. All she needed was you to show up. And it's the same thing with Jesus. All Jesus wants is for you to say yes and respond and come to the table. A good host invites everyone to come, sets the table at their own cost, and expects nothing in return, giving of themselves for your sake only. Why? Because that's how Jesus hosted himself. At the end of Jesus' life, we find him again around a table. Now, you might recognize this table if you turn into Matthew's Gospel. Jesus is hosting a meal. It's the Passover meal. In an upper room in Jerusalem, gathered around, reclined around a table with his friends and his family, but Jesus is the host. Jesus is the host of this meal, this holiday gathering. And here's what the story in Matthew 26 tells us. When evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." They were very, very sad and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord." Jesus replied, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him, but woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi." Jesus answered, "You have said so." When they were eating, gathered, they were just reclining. Jesus takes the bread. He gave thanks to God. He broke it. And he gave it to those gathered around that table, and he said, "Take and eat, my friends. This is my body." And he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and he said, "Drink from this, each of you. This is my blood of a covenant poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit from the vine from now on until the day I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. In these verses, Jesus sets out for us the example of what it means to live a life of generosity. He is the greatest host who embodies everything he just taught the host in Luke 14. He invites everyone to the table. You see, the reason we get this detail about Judas dipping the bread in the same bowl as Jesus is because in all likelihood, Judas would have been seated right next to Jesus. He was the keeper of the treasury, after all. It would have been an honored place at the table for one of his chief disciples. The one who was going to betray Jesus was seated in a place of honor. That says far more about Jesus than it does about Judas. Jesus welcomes everyone to the table, even those who would betray him. And if we're going to follow the example of Jesus, we too must set the table. Welcome folks to the table who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who don't vote like us, who don't treat us kindly, who don't say nice things. Yet we still invite them to the table. Secondly, Jesus is the greatest host because he set the meal at his own cost. At every Jewish meal, there were two staples, bread and wine, ordinary parts of the meal. And yet Jesus takes the mundane and he performs miracles. This bread, this is my body that's about to be broken for you. This blood, this is my blood. Every mistake, every misstep, every sin, every brokenness in your life is going to be covered over by this blood. And he pays for it himself in his body and in his blood for the world. And finally, Jesus is the greatest host because he expects nothing in return. There's no quid pro quo. Throughout the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes again and again about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that it is a freely given gift of God. Hear this, friends. You cannot be this morning or any day. You can never be good enough to receive an unearned gift of the magnitude of what Jesus put out. And yet, Jesus gives it to you. Freely given. All Jesus wants is for us to come and join him at the table, to be in relationship with him, to come and experience what that love and that grace looks like and tastes like. It's an appropriate way, I think, to talk about generosity in this series this morning. Because there's no better example of overflowing generosity than Jesus himself. The table and the meal that he invites all of us to come and experience. So today I want to invite you to this table. It's open to all. I want to invite you to come and taste and see that our Lord is good. Let us pray.